Michael Milanovic is deeply involved in the examination of English teaching around the world. And he has a very special message for Australians. First, the Chinese are going to be the biggest English-speaking nation in the world. More Chinese will speak English than those in conventional English countries. But second, we've always thought, or certainly I've thought, that we had a big advantage as being an English-speaking country when English was the business language of the world. Turns out that's a two-edged sword. Yes, we do have an advantage, but no, because we are natural English speakers, we often don't learn a second and third language. And so we don't get the cultural advantage of that bilingual process. And so we find in Asia or in Europe that we mix with communities of people who speak different languages and get a cultural linkage that we don't get. And that's turning out to be a great disadvantage to English-speaking countries and companies. And this is an important change, given that the countries to our north are the big growth areas. Australians are not only going to need to speak English as their base language and speak it well, but they will need a much greater cultural exposure to excel in the countries to our north. Michael, tell us about the boom in English language learning.
We've seen English grow in China, in India, Brazil. All of these countries realize that the English language is almost a passport to economic success. And without it, it's incredibly difficult to carry out trade and so on.
And so the Chinese aren't looking to use Mandarin as the language around the world?
No, I mean, obviously they use Chinese within China, but once they go outside China, English is the language they use. In fact, there's more English being learned in China than anywhere else.
Really?
There's probably about 500 million people learning English in China right now. And some people project that there will be more Chinese speakers of English than any other nationality over the next 30 years or so.
Does this give an advantage to English-speaking companies? The fact that this base language is being used internationally, does that help them?
It probably does help them in some ways, but in fact, one of the adverse consequences is that native speakers of English are tending to be monolingual, and native speakers of other languages are tending to be bilingual, trilingual, or whatever. And I think that in the long term, that's probably quite damaging, because it means that we native speakers of English will have less access to other people's cultures, and will actually find ourselves in some way more isolated by not being able to dig deeper into other people's cultures through their languages.
In Australia, the growth areas to our north, China, India, and the other countries, so we almost have a disadvantage being an English-based language country.
I think that we have a disadvantage, a potential disadvantage from that cultural dimension, from that cultural perspective, yes, because it makes it more difficult for us to access and understand other cultures because we're not learning the languages as we may have done in the past.
Well, how does this translate in say, Europe?
Well, what we often find is that in a situation where you have people from various European countries, the Brits will be monolingual, whereas the other people from other countries will be fluent in 2 or possibly 3 languages, and so the interactions will be multilingual in that room, probably with the exception of the British, who will tend to operate in one language.
So the French and the Germans can do a side deal in the same room.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that's often the sort of thing that happens. So you find yourself.
You'd really get cross, wouldn't you, if you're British? What are you guys doing?
Well, but you know, that goes beyond that. So you find yourself in a situation where, because native English speakers tend to be monolingual. They're not always monolingual.
Yeah,
I mean, obviously, but there's a tendency for that to be the case. They will often find themselves unable to kind of plug in to these other conversations which are going on, which a lot of the Europeans certainly will be able to do.
And that, of course, is one of our disadvantages as we move in Asia too.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.